You people always try something. The word snapped out, sharp as a slap, slicing through the elegance of first class like shattered glass. Every head in the cabin turned, eyes wide, as though struck by an invisible current. It was not an ordinary refusal. It was a sentence, a label, a blade, small and precise, cutting into the polished silence of the cabin. Dr. Eleanor Carter, 42, stood there. First, class ticket in hand, a small suitcase by her side, blazer pressed to perfection. She had done nothing wrong. Yet opposite her stood Flight Attendant Rachel Monroe, 34, lips pressed into a thin smile, eyes cold. The one who had just uttered those words. Not shouted, not loud, but loud enough for the rows behind to hear. Sharp enough to puncture the air that had been serene seconds before. Elena did not blink, not a wasted movement. She simply offered the ticket again, voice steady and unshaken. 2A. First class. Purchased directly. But Rachel did not glance at the paper. Her eyes slid past it, dismissive, and landed squarely on Eleanor's skin. Her smirk widened, knife-like. You don't look like a doctor. Another cut, fast, cold. Then came the next strike. You look like you belong in coach. The polished leather seats gleamed under soft lights, champagne flutes shimmered with golden bubbles, yet the entire cabin froze. A few heads swiveled, a phone screen lit up. Whispers rose. Who does she think she is? In seat 3A, Sophie Lane, 27, blonde hair tousled around her Kindle, pretended to read. But her hands trembled. Each flick of the page rushed. She heard. She knew it was wrong. But her lips stayed shut. Silence, she thought, was safer. In seat 4B, James Holloway, 55, a retired firefighter, sat upright, eyes fixed forward. He had once walked into burning buildings to drag strangers out. Yet now he only gripped the armrest, anger swelling. Why am I sitting still? Why am I letting this happen? And Elena? She remained still, her face unshaken, heart steady, breath calm. Because she knew, reaction was a kind of currency. Spend it, and her worth could be bargained down. She chose differently. Silence. A silence long enough to let the truth reveal itself. Rachel, meanwhile, believed she had seized control. To her, this was just a difficult passenger, a nuisance to sweep away. Her smirk sharpened, half-mouthed, as if victory was certain. She did not know that in this very moment she was planting the seed of a storm that would rip open the quiet skies of her airline. From seat 1C, Thomas Blake, 51, leaned toward his neighbor and whispered, "Watch. She's going to pull the discrimination card any second now." He chuckled, lifting his phone. The title he typed, Flight Fraud in Real Time. A murmur spread. Whispers. Cameras lifted. The event was no longer private. It became theater, where passengers chose their roles, the accuser, the mocker, and the silent majority. The cabin, once discreet and refined, transformed into a courtroom where Elena was forced before an invisible bench. But she did not plead. She did not argue. She sat down in seat 2A, her seat, and placed the ticket neatly on the tray table. Her hands moved lightly, but her eyes gleamed with quiet defiance. I will not only sit down, I will rise by refusing to move. A ripple stirred through the cabin. They thought they had seen it all. A woman of color, questioned, surely flustered, surely angry, surely loud. But Elena refused the familiar script. She rewrote it, with composure, with an unyielding gaze that forced the aggressor to recoil. And that was the beginning of one of the costliest scandals in the history of the airline. The beginning of a lesson that would redefine how people viewed power and silence. Eleanor Carter sat tall. The cabin was silent, but in that silence, a voice had already begun to thunder, the voice of a storm waiting to break. The whispers in the cabin grew louder, spreading from seat to seat like a small but relentless disturbance. Someone chuckled, someone sneered, and several phones had already begun recording in secret. The air was heavy, as if every passenger had silently delivered a verdict. Elena sat in 2A, posture upright, shoulders relaxed. Her hands rested lightly on the armrests, as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside, fragments of memory flashed, moments of suspicion, piercing stares, words of denial she had grown accustomed to, but that had never stopped hurting. She swallowed it all down, keeping her face composed with absolute calm. No one knew. She had already acted. With just 3 short text messages. One to Maya Benson, her personal assistant, 29, who checked her phone every 3 minutes without fail. One to Jonathan Reed, her senior attorney, 48, a man who never missed the chance to file a record from the very first second. And one to the contact saved under a cold, simple name, board chair, private. Those messages were concise, without a single wasted word. Just coordinates, flight number, and 2 words, incident started. The phone slipped back into her jacket pocket. Nothing more was needed. The game had already begun. Rachel stood by the cabin door, her lips still curled in a forced smile, eyes scanning as though searching for an audience. And she found one on the screen of her own phone. With a practiced flick, Rachel opened a live stream app. The camera came alive. "Hey fam," her voice rang out, smug and lilting. "You won't believe what's going on today." The lens angled toward Eleanor. No names, no direct accusations, but enough of a hint. A passenger out of place. Viewers poured in. 100, 500, 1,200. The counter leapt like a rising tide. Rachel smirked, catching sight of the comments flooding in. She's probably sneaking in. That bag looks fake, always playing the victim. In seat 1C, Thomas Blake, the middle-aged man, joined the spectacle. He straightened his tie, raised his phone, and typed a caption for his video. Flight fraud in real time. Let's see how this plays out. To him, this was not reality. It was entertainment. In the cabin, tiny sounds of judgment swelled into a chaotic chorus. She's stalling. Probably not even her bag. Wait for it. Discrimination rant incoming. Elena heard every word, each one like a needle. Yet she did not react. Instead, she smoothed the crease of her blazer, crossed her legs, and sat tall, silent steady. It was the kind of silence that unsettled her opponents, because they expected her to protest, to fight, to shout. They had already prepared the script for the angry woman of color. But Elena refused to play the role. And it was that unexpected void that made the cabin itself tilt. In row 3B, Marisol Vega, a 23-year-old aerospace engineering student, watched quietly. Her jaw clenched, her hand trembled slightly, eyes shifting from Rachel, reveling in her screen, to Elena, composed as a statue. In Marisol's mind, one question echoed. If I speak up, will anyone listen? Or will I be dragged down too? In 4B, James Holloway kept staring. He had witnessed countless injustices in his life, but this felt different. It stirred a fury deep inside him. The truth, when it threatens a lie, is always branded interference. Rachel kept performing, every shrug, every smirk, as though victory was hers. The screen in front of her glowed, comments flooded faster, the number of viewers climbed past 10,000. An invisible crowd was cheering, not for justice, but for humiliation. Yet Rachel did not know. None of them in that cabin knew. Elena Carter did not need to justify herself. She only needed time, because the truth was already in motion, in emails, in texts, in the boardroom hundreds of miles away. The cabin was no longer a cabin. It had become a courtroom. Every passenger, every online viewer, every silent gaze, they had already chosen a side. And Elena's silence, mistaken for weakness, resounded like a hidden drumbeat, heralding a storm about to break. The whispers were no longer whispers. They swelled, bouncing from row to row like the rumble of engines in turbulence. The first-class cabin, a place meant for the clink of champagne glasses and the quiet roll of luggage, had turned into a chaotic courtroom. A male voice rang out from row 3, clear and deliberate. "She probably just bought a coach ticket and snuck up here. Don't think no one noticed." Soft laughter followed, murmurs of agreement rippling around. In seat 1B, a businessman in a tailored grey suit, Harold Finch, 47, leaned toward his seatmate and whispered, "Just wait. In a few minutes, she'll start crying discrimination. They always do." He lowered his voice, but loud enough for 4 rows around to hear. Phones were raised, lenses aimed at Elena. Some passengers weren't even sure what they wanted to capture, justice or spectacle, but all were eager to watch. Elena did not react. She simply placed her handbag neatly beneath her seat, sat upright, her gaze steady on the space ahead. Her heart beat slowly, deliberately. She had weathered thousands of hours of conferences, hundreds of public interrogations. Her strength had never been in shouting back. It was in preparation, and she had prepared long ago. Those 3 brief text messages she had sent earlier were the spark. Now, all she had to do was wait for the fire to catch. In 3A, Sophie Lane, the young woman with the Kindle, stayed silent. She had seen everything. The way Rachel shoved the boarding pass back into Elena's chest, the smirk that landed like a slap. Sophie's fingers clutched the Kindle so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She wanted to speak up, but a fleeting glance from another passenger, eyes sharp with suspicion, a warning, froze her throat. "If I say something, they'll turn on me. I'm not strong enough. Across the aisle, in 4B, James Holloway shifted in his seat. He had extinguished plenty of fires in his life, but the blaze in front of him, the blaze of prejudice, was harder to put out than any he had ever known. He growled low, just enough for Rachel to hear. "Excuse me, ma'am." I saw the boarding pass. It clearly said 2A. First class. Rachel did not bother turning back. Her voice was sharp and cold. "Sir, please remain in your seat. Do not interfere. Security will be here shortly." Interfere. One small word, heavy as a gavel. It turned truth into trouble. It twisted justice into disruption. James felt the heat rise in his chest, but he gripped the armrest tighter, holding back. From an aisle seat nearby, an older man with silver hair, voice tinged with the South, spoke loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "What's going on here? She clearly doesn't belong." "Just look at her." His wife touched his hand, not to stop him, but to remind him, cameras are rolling. She knew he was wrong, but she didn't want him to quit, only to keep his voice down. Elena still did not move. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady. To a casual glance, she might have looked like a traveler settling in for a long flight, but her composure was no retreat. It was a counterattack, and it was beginning to work. A few passengers, among them Marisol Vega, a 23-year-old aerospace engineering student, were no longer laughing. She had heard the mockery, seen Rachel's mocking live stream. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with the realization that she was witnessing something bigger than a seat dispute. She knew the name Elena Carter. She had read Elena's research on jet engine technology. But her mind wavered. Could it really be her? Up front, Rachel was still consumed by her screen. Online viewers had surged past 12,000. Comments rolled in like a tide. "She's lying. That's not even her bag. Cue the lawsuit." Elena heard it all, but she knew reaction was a weapon, and she would not let anyone take it from her. In the cabin, lines were drawn. Supporters stayed silent. Detractors grew louder. Spectators reveled. This was no longer a space for travel. It had become a courtroom where justice, prejudice, and truth were bartered in front of thousands of unseen witnesses. Elena sat there and waited. The pounding of footsteps echoed down the narrow aisle. Thud, thud, thud. Each strike reverberated like a hammer blow against the eardrums of the passengers. The air inside the cabin thickened, tightening as if someone had just locked the doors of an invisible courtroom. Two figures appeared. Grant Daniels, 44, tall and broad, his face clean, cut, his eyes carrying the cold precision of a man long accustomed to authority. Behind him, Ethan Miller, 39, younger but tense, the outline of a bulletproof vest swelling beneath his uniform. They entered the cabin not like attendants addressing a seating issue, but like officers walking into an arrest. Rachel straightened her posture immediately, her half-smile flashing as though she had rehearsed it. Her voice rang out, loud and sharp. "Here. This is her. This passenger has refused to vacate her seat, attempting to sit in first class without a valid ticket. I've asked multiple times, and she has refused to comply. the passengers murmured. Phones rose higher. The number on Rachel's live stream spiked again. Over 15,000 were now watching live. Daniels fixed his cold gaze on Eleanor. He wasn't seeing a passenger. He was seeing a target. "Ma'am," he said in a clipped tone, "I need you to stand up and step off this plane until we clear this up." The cabin held its breath. Every eye was trained on the woman in seat 2A. Elena looked up. Her eyes were calm, still as glass, her voice even, neither raised nor lowered. "I am sitting in the seat I purchased, seat 2A, first class." Daniels pressed, his tone hardening. "Do you have proof?" Without the slightest hurry, Elena opened her bag. All eyes followed every movement, many expecting to see hesitation or nervous hands. Instead, she removed a wallet, pulled out a card, and placed it neatly on the tray table. Sleek, heavy, the black sheen unmistakable. An American Express Centurion. The card that most people only ever heard about in rumors. Then, sliding out from the wallet, a silver-edged business card caught the light. Dr. Eleanor Carter, founder and CEO, Nova Aerospace Systems. The silence was immediate, absolute. Rachel's lip curled, her voice dropping low but sharp enough for nearby Rose to hear. "Anyone can print a business card." Elena tilted her head slightly, her gaze slicing like a blade. "And anyone can disgrace themselves. That much is obvious." Whispers shifted. A few glances turned, not at Elena, but at Rachel. Still, Daniels held firm, his voice rigid. "Dr. Takata, I need you to step off the aircraft until this matter is resolved." This time, Elena didn't answer right away. She lifted her phone, tapped once. No one heard the content, only saw the glow of the screen, and then its sudden darkening. A signal sent, a door opening somewhere far away. A move played on the board. She raised her eyes, her tone calm, steady, yet weighted like iron. "I advise you to call the captain. Immediately. You are about to make a mistake that will cost you dearly." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. The kind that comes from someone used to signing contracts with 7 zeros. Someone who had negotiated with governments. Someone who knew the exact value of silence. Daniels hesitated. Rachel frowned. A subtle shift in power, intangible but undeniable, began threading its way through the cabin. In 3B, Marisol Vega's mouth fell open, her heart hammering. She recognized the name on the card. She remembered reading Elena's keynote at the Aerospace Summit. It was really her. And if it was, then this airline had just lit the fuse to a disaster. In 4B, James Holloway clenched his fist, a quiet satisfaction rising in his chest. Finally. This was the moment the tide would turn. The cockpit door opened with a faint click. Light spilled into the cabin. A figure stepped out, tall, silver, haired, a presence both calm and commanding. Captain Richard Hayes, 58, a veteran of hundreds of transatlantic flights, emerged with the poise of a general entering the battlefield. The cabin froze. The live stream kept rolling. The cameras kept capturing. But everything had just shifted. The cockpit door closed behind him, and the presence of Captain Richard Hayes filled the cabin like an unspoken command for silence. The 58-year-old man stood tall, broad-shouldered, his silver hair cut neatly, his eyes seasoned by thousands of storms in the skies. He did not need to raise his voice or tap his authority, yet the entire cabin froze as he stepped forward. What exactly is happening here? His tone was clipped, steady, carrying the weight of command. Rachel straightened immediately, her phone still running a live stream, but lowered halfway out of sight. Her voice rang out with confidence. "Captain, this passenger is in the wrong seat. I've asked her multiple times, but she refused to comply. She clearly doesn't belong in first class." All eyes turned again to Elena. Hayes pivoted toward the woman seated calmly in 2A. He noticed the stillness, different from guilt, different from fear. It was the stillness of someone waiting. He extended his hand. "May I see your boarding pass and ID, ma'am?" Without a wasted gesture, Elena handed them over. The boarding pass read clearly, "Seat 2A, first class." The ID bore her name, Dr. Elena Carter. On the tray table beside her still lay the silver-edged business card, Nova Aerospace Systems. Hayes read once, then again. His eyes narrowed slightly. Nova Aerospace. The name rang like a familiar bell. A memory stirred. Months earlier, in a corporate briefing room, he had listened as executives discussed renewing their lease of jet engines. Engines designed and supplied by Nova. This airline was dependent on their technology. His eyes rose to Eleanor once more. She was no ordinary passenger. Something far more significant sat before him. He tapped into his own crew tablet, fingers moving with the swiftness of experience. The system displayed her record. Carter, Eleanor, Doctor. Seat 2A, first class. Purchased via Premier Line. Paid in full. 2,987. The cabin hushed, broken only by the captain's keystrokes. When Hayes finally looked up, his gaze had shifted. No longer suspicion, but caution, even respect. "All information checks out," he said, his voice lower, firmer. "Dr. Carter is exactly where she belongs." Rachel froze. Her live stream still ran, but comments had begun to turn. "Wait, she's legit? Nova Aerospace. Oh my God, she designs the engines." Elena gave no response, only the faintest nod. Hayes inhaled slowly, then turned to the cabin, his voice resonant and commanding. "I believe we all owe Dr. Carter an apology." A simple sentence, but the weight of it rippled louder than the engines outside. Passengers straightened in their seats. Those who had sneered looked away, shame flooding their eyes. Sophie Lane in 3A exhaled, her trembling hands finally steady. James Holloway nodded firmly, as if watching justice kindle into flame. Rachel tried to protest, her voice faltering. But anyone can print a business card." Hayes wheeled around, his eyes icy. "And anyone can disgrace themselves. That much is obvious." The words struck like a gavel. Rachel swallowed hard, her cheeks burning red as she hurriedly tapped her phone to kill the live stream. But it was too late. What needed to spread had already spread. Elena remained composed, her gaze serene. In that silence, she reclaimed not only her seat, but the upper hand. And she knew this was only the beginning. Nova Aerospace was merely the surface. She still carried another card in her coat pocket, one with far greater force. A few passengers snapped photos, posting them instantly. Twitter feeds began filling with tags. Eleanor Carter. Nova. Aerospace. The story was already escaping the confines of the plane. After a moment's thought, Captain Hayes folded his tablet and inclined his head subtly toward Elena, a quiet gesture of respect. He understood that this moment had already transcended the boundaries of a single flight. The cabin, which had just been a courtroom, had now become the stage for truth. Inside the cabin, silence fell heavy, like a velvet curtain closing at the end of a play. But outside, in the world of millions of scrolling thumbs, a storm was gathering. Thomas Blake's phone in seat 1C buzzed violently. He had just uploaded a video with a mocking caption, "Passenger refuses to leave first class." Typical. But within minutes, the comments shifted tone. Wait, is that a Centurion card? Nova Aerospace? She's the CEO. Buddy, you just filmed the woman who owns the engines you're flying on. Thomas stared at his screen, sweat dampening the back of his neck. The video he thought would spark laughter was already turning into evidence against him. In just 10 minutes, it had been shared nearly 500 times, and the trend was only accelerating. In seat 3B, Marisol Vega scrolled with trembling hands. The aviation community's news page had already reposted the clip with a bold headline, "Meet Dr. Eleanor Carter, the woman reshaping aviation technology." Her jaw dropped. A photo of Elena speaking at an aerospace conference flashed across the screen. It was her, the very same woman, sitting a few rows ahead, silent as stone, yet in truth the architect of an entire industry. Social media did not stop at tweets. Reddit exploded with new threads. #fly with respect, #Eleanor Carter, #airline disaster. TikTok flooded with frame-by-frame breakdowns, Rachel's smirk, the shove of the boarding pass into Elena's chest, Captain Hayes' intervention. Every detail became evidence in the online trial, now watched by hundreds of thousands. Inside the cabin, Rachel Monroe still held her phone, but the screen had turned traitor. Comments poured in, hitting her eyes like daggers. "This is your boss's boss. You just ended your career live. Delete this while you can." Rachel's face drained of color. She tried frantically to shut off the stream, but the video had already been saved, re-uploaded, clipped. Once the internet smelled blood, it never let go. Eleanor sat still, her gaze never flicking to a single screen. She knew from the moment her message was sent, the balance had shifted. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to prove anything. Time and facts would do the work for her. In seat 4B, James Holloway allowed himself the faintest smile. He murmured under his breath, "They think they hold power, but forget that real power never needs to shout." Meanwhile, in office towers hundreds of miles away, urgent emails marked in red were already hitting the desks of airline executives. The words Nova Aerospace flashed inside billion-dollar leasing contracts. Legal, public relations, even the board of directors had received the same warning. Passenger 2A in first class was not just a passenger. She was a critical partner. Elena breathed evenly. Her back rested against the seat, her shoulders loose. In her mind, she pictured the dominoes falling. A short video clip, trending worldwide, shareholder pressure, press coverage, government inquiries, all triggered by a single spark. And that spark Rachel had struck for her. A few rows behind, Sophie Lane held her Kindle, but couldn't focus on a single word. She lifted her eyes to Elena, her gaze filled with quiet admiration. This was no victim. This was someone rewriting the script for the entire flight. The storm outside was raging, but inside the cabin, Elena remained seated, silent. And it was that silence that made everything else roar all the louder. The first-class cabin sank into a strange trance. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of people realizing they may have chosen the wrong side. Rachel kept her head down, fingers trembling as she tried to delete the live stream, but her screen was still flooded with warnings. Captain Hayes stood nearby, breathing slowly, already calculating the speed at which this crisis was spreading. Only one person remained calm: Elena Carter. She did not speak. She did not move hastily. Instead, she slowly opened her jacket pocket and pulled out a second business card. No silver shine, no bold logos. Just a matte white card, minimalist font, black ink pressed neatly across the surface. She placed it on the tray table, deliberately letting the cabin light fall directly across the line of text. Horizon Capital Partners, Elena Carter, co-founder and CO. The air tightened. A few passengers nearby leaned forward to read, then sat back as if the card itself had pushed them. A sharp intake of breath came from seat 3B. Marisol Vega, an aerospace engineering student, instantly recognized the name. Horizon, one of the most powerful private equity firms with holdings across global transportation, including Atlantic Airlines, the very courier they were flying on. Marisol covered her mouth, her eyes wide. She whispered, just loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. She's a shareholder of our parent company. The words spread like sparks catching dry grass. Murmurs raced through the cabin, faster than Wi-Fi. In 1C, Thomas Blake felt his stomach twist into knots. He had turned Elena into a punchline in his video. Now he realized this woman was not just a first-class passenger, not just a CEO in aerospace, but a stakeholder in the very airline carrying him across the sky. His grip tightened around his phone as a thought thundered in his mind. I've just destroyed my own reputation. Rachel staggered back a step, her face drained of color. Her lips parted, then closed again. No argument left to cling to. Her entire body felt hollow. No longer the powerful first-class attendant, but just an employee moments away from losing her job in front of the world. Captain Hayes looked down at the card, then back up at Elena. His eyes grew heavy. He understood instantly. This was no longer about a seat. This was a level 1 crisis, where a major shareholder of the airline had just been publicly humiliated by his crew. Elena lifted her head. Her voice was low but clear, slicing through the silence like a blade. I suggest you notify the highest authority in the company. Not the gate manager, not the flight supervisor. Someone who understands just how severe this relationship truly is. The words were measured, but the impact rattled the cabin like turbulence. In 4B, James Holloway nodded to himself, his chest swelling. This is it. This is the turning point. That silence wasn't weakness. It was a weapon. Phones buzzed throughout the cabin, news alerts, trending hashtags. On Twitter, a financial analyst had already posted, Horizon Capital currently holds 12% of Atlantic Airlines. CEO and shareholder Eleanor Carter was just denied her first-class seat on the very airline she partially owns. #airline crisis. Comments poured in. This isn't just a PR disaster. This is corporate suicide. You can deny a passenger, but you can't deny a major shareholder. Quiet power. Respect it. Elena leaned back into her seat, eyes half closed. She didn't need to do anything else. A single card, quietly placed on the table, had been enough to flip the entire game. First class was no longer a courtroom. It had become the scene of a mass unmasking. Everyone in the cabin now understood. They had underestimated the wrong person. And the cost of that mistake would not be paid in mere apologies. The cabin air was thick, heavy, as if every passenger could feel the weight of a scale tipping. The woman they had once whispered about and mocked was suddenly revealed as the one holding the fate of this flight, and the company itself in her hands. Elena Carter sat tall, her voice calm but resonant, like the strike of a metal bell. I have 3 demands, effective immediately. Every eye snapped toward her. Rachel's grip tightened on her phone, her face drained of color. Captain Hayes stood rigid, his hand gripping the seat back as though awaiting a verdict. Elena paused, letting the silence expand across the cabin like smoke filling a room. Then she spoke again, each word falling with the weight of stone. 1. The immediate termination of any employee who filmed, streamed, or shared images of passengers without their consent. Murmurs spread. Several passengers glanced toward Rachel. Her hands trembled as tears welled in her eyes, remembering the live stream now trending worldwide. 2, Eleanor continued, the entire crew involved in this incident is to be suspended immediately pending investigation. No exceptions. Hayes drew a sharp breath. He knew exactly what that meant. The entire first-class team facing suspension. Passengers' eyes turned toward the attendants retreating into the corner of the cabin, their faces tight, as though hearing a death sentence. 3. Eleanor lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping the cabin as though addressing thousands of shareholders in a conference hall. I demand a formal apology from corporate leadership, not a few lines of messaging. A public statement admitting fault and committing to reforming the service culture. If not, she leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping but its weight doubling. All negotiations between Nova Aerospace and Atlantic Airlines will be suspended indefinitely. A heartbeat skipped. Everyone in the cabin understood what that meant. 14 aircraft already in operation, 20 new contracts ready to sign. Billions of dollars. And now, with a single declaration, Elena could turn it all to ash. Captain Hayes swallowed hard, then gave a small nod. I will report this immediately. His voice shook, rare for a man who had piloted hundreds of the transatlantic flights. But he understood perfectly. Sitting across from him was not an angry passenger, but a shareholder ready to cut the lifeline. The cabin buzzed with whispers. Some passengers shook their heads in disbelief. Others began to clap lightly, hesitant but supportive. In 4B, James Holloway nodded firmly, eyes flashing with satisfaction. Finally, truth had reclaimed its place. Meanwhile, in 3B, Marisol Vega hurriedly opened her phone and typed, "Biggest lesson today. Real power never shouts. It only needs 3 sentences. At quiet power. Eleanor Carter." Rachel slumped back against the cabin wall. Every word Elena spoke struck like a hammer blow, shattering the illusion of authority she had clung to. She remembered the smugness of her live stream. Some folks just think they can sit wherever they want. And now, she was the one with no place left to stand. Captain Hayes lifted his radio, his voice urgent. "This is an emergency. I need direct connection to executive leadership immediately." Static crackled. Then a tense voice came through the earpiece. "We're aware. The incident has already hit the press. The board is in emergency session. Keep the scene as it is. Do nothing further that could make this worse." Elena closed her eyes briefly. A faint smile flickered, not arrogant, not triumphant. Just the quiet smile of someone who knew they had played the right move at the right time. First class fell silent once more. But everyone understood. The storm was no longer contained within the cabin. It had already spilled into boardrooms, legal offices, and the stock market. First class fell into a silence that was anything but peaceful. It was heavy, ashamed, like a mirror forcing each person to confront their own reflection. The one to break it was the very man who had helped push Elena into the storm from the start. Thomas Blake, the 51-year-old businessman in seat 1C, slowly stood. In his hand was the phone that had once broadcast a mocking video and now stood as evidence condemning himself. His voice trembled, but it carried enough for the entire cabin to hear. "I want to apologize." He looked at Elena, then at the passengers around him. "I judged you. I recorded that video to mock you, to turn you into entertainment. I didn't ask. I didn't try to understand. I just assumed and ridiculed. That video of mine is already spreading everywhere, but—" He raised the phone like a confession. "I will repost the truth. The whole truth. Uncut." Elena said nothing. She only gave a small nod, her gaze steady. Yet in that moment, Thomas felt a fragment of forgiveness, not from her words, but from the silence that allowed him to face himself. In 3A, Sophie Lane, the young woman with the half-open Kindle, drew a deep breath. Her voice cracked, but her resolve was sharp. "I heard everything Rachel said to Dr. Carter, and I stayed silent." She swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes. "I lowered my head, pretended to read, to avoid trouble. I was afraid. But the truth is, I was a coward, and I know I have to admit that." Whispers rippled through the cabin. Some nodded. Some lifted their eyes from their screens and turned toward Eleanor. In 4B, James Holloway, the former firefighter, leaned forward, his voice steady and warm. "Admitting fault matters. A lot of people never do it. You're braver than you think." Sophie blinked, exhaling as though shedding a weight. Marisol Vega, 23 in 3B, had stayed quiet until now. But then she opened her own live stream, pointed the camera toward Elena, and whispered to her audience in both English and Spanish. "Look closely. This isn't just a CEO. This is a living lesson. A woman showing us that true power never needs to shout." Within minutes, her viewer count doubled. From seat 2D, a silver-haired woman, who earlier had sided with her husband's dismissive remark, suddenly placed her trembling hand over his. She lifted her gaze toward Elena, her voice raspy. "I am guilty too. I nodded when my husband said, 'She doesn't belong here.' I let prejudice guide me, and I treated it as normal." Her voice broke, then spilled into sobs. "But no. None of this is normal. I was part of the problem." The word sent a shudder through the cabin. This was no longer just scattered apologies. It was a collective confession. Elena raised her head. Her voice was low, yet it rang like a bronze bell. "Change does not begin when someone is caught. Change begins when we choose to face what we've ignored." The cabin exhaled together, as though everyone had set down a mask they had carried too long. In that moment, seat 2A was no longer simply Elena Carter's place. It had become a podium, and the entire first-class cabin, the same people who had laughed, filmed, judged, had suddenly become students of a lesson in courage and accountability. The confessions, the nods, the lowered eyes. It was as if the first-class cabin had been cleansed. But Elena Carter did not stop at reflection. She knew apologies were necessary, yet they only patched a crack. The real fractures ran deep within the structure of the entire system. Elena sat upright, her hand resting lightly on a slim tablet. The screen glowed, revealing files prepared long before. She lifted her head, her voice steady, sharp. "I am not interested in personal compensation. I do not want a private letter of apology. I want systemic change, and I have the plan right here." Captain Hayes spun around, his eyes wide. A few passengers stirred in surprise. Marisol Vega quickly lifted her phone, recording every second. Elena swiped the screen, each bullet point appearing in bold clarity. First, every employee who interacts directly with customers must undergo unconscious bias training, not once, but regularly, monitored and independently evaluated. Some flight attendants lowered their heads. Rachel swallowed hard, her eyes glistening, knowing she had just become the living example of that bias. Second, passenger verification must rely solely on documents, on evidence, not on personal impressions. No more of "you don't look like" or "you don't belong." The system will decide, not prejudice. From seat 2D, the silver-haired woman gave a small nod, tears streaking down her face. Elena's words tore apart the flimsy excuse she and her husband had once clung to. Third, a 24/7 independent hotline for passengers must be established, not under the airline's direct control, but operated by a neutral oversight board. Any passenger mistreated will have an immediate place to be heard. The sound of keys clattering echoed from the back row. One passenger had opened a laptop, frantically typing notes. The media storm was ready to seize every word. Eleanor drew a breath, then continued, her tone dropping lower, carrying even greater weight. And finally, quarterly transparency reports on diversity and equity in service. These reports must be submitted to the Federal Aviation Administration and made public, so everyone will know exactly how this airline treats its passengers. The cabin trembled with shock. This was no longer a list of demands. It was a manifesto for reform. Captain Hayes froze, sweat forming at his temple. He stammered, This is an enormous undertaking." Elena turned, her gaze cold as steel, though her voice remained calm. "This is only the beginning. If you want contracts with Nova Aerospace to continue, if you want Horizon Capital's investment to remain, this is the price. Not a price paid to me, but to every passenger whose dignity has ever been denied." The passengers sat still, as if witnessing the passing of a verdict. In 3B, Marisol whispered into her live stream, "She isn't just demanding a seat for herself. She's rewriting the rules for all of us." A man in a suit in the front row gave a slow nod, exhaling heavily. James Holloway clenched his fist, his face glowing with belief. Sophie Lane's eyes welled with tears, her shoulders trembling, but this time from hope. Elena tapped once, sending an email on the spot, attaching the full plan to the airline's legal department with a C to the regulators. With a single touch, the manifesto had left the confines of the cabin, transforming into a mandate for an entire whole system. The engines rumbled beneath the floor, signaling the moment of takeoff. But within each passenger, they knew this flight was not merely leaving the runway. It had just launched a journey of reform. Elena Carter leaned back, eyes half closed. She needed no further words. Everything had been laid on the table as the first bricks of a new foundation. The low hum of the engines rolled beneath the floor as the plane eased away from the gate. The cabin remained silent, but it was no longer the tense silence of the beginning. This was the silence of people who had just witnessed something greater than a seat dispute. They had witnessed the birth of a new standard. Elena Carter sat upright in seat 2A. Not in defiance, but in the presence of someone who had affirmed her right to exist by holding fast in absolute silence. She did not shout. She did not rage. She did not wield her title as a weapon. It was all calm, preparation, and timing. In the minds of many passengers, the comparison rang clear. Loud power needs microphones, cameras, raised voices to be heard. But true power, quiet power, needs only to sit still, and the world shifts around it. In seat 3A, Sophie Lane closed her Kindle. Her hands no longer shook. Instead, a strange determination filled her. Next time she saw injustice, she would not stay silent. She swore it to herself, knowing it was a debt she owed to today's lesson. In 3B, Marisol Vega kept her live stream running. But this time, she did not whisper. Her voice was firm, steady. "We just witnessed Quilance turn into a weapon. Elena Carter defended not just her own rights, but the rights of anyone who has ever been dismissed. This is history, Hackshirt's quiet power." Comments flooded in. "Inspiring. She's a legend. Never underestimate again." In 4B, James Holloway leaned back with a faint smile. He had put out countless fires in his life, but today he had seen a fire of a different kind, the fire of truth, ignite on its own, untouchable. Captain Hayes still stood nearby. He looked at Elena one last time before returning to the cockpit. In his eyes was a rare respect, not born of rank or uniform, but of having witnessed a woman force an entire system to bow with only a few sentences. Rachel Monroe stood tucked into the corner of the cabin, clutching the phone she had finally switched off. The termination notice had not yet appeared on her screen, but she knew it was coming. Her face was vacant. Everything she had once believed, that the power of a uniform, of preferred passengers, of prejudice, could decide who belonged where, all of it had just dissolved into smoke. Elena closed her eyes lightly. In that moment, she was no longer passenger 2A. She had become a symbol for everyone who had ever been underestimated, ever pushed to the margins. The captain's voice came over the speakers, deep and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for takeoff. I hope you enjoy this flight in comfort, and above all, in mutual respect." A simple message. Yet in the cabin, many heads lifted, sensing that respect had just been redefined. Outside the window, the runway stretched ahead like a fresh chapter. The plane rumbled, gathering speed. And in the hearts of those on board, it felt as though they too were lifting off, not just toward another destination, but toward a future where silence could become the loudest voice of all. Elena opened her eyes, staring straight ahead. She had not only kept her seat, she had handed back the seat of fairness, to everyone who had ever been told they did not belong. Quiet power. No pleading, no begging. It builds, it shapes, and when rooted in truth, it becomes the thunder of justice. The plane rose into the sky, and with it, Elena Carter became a symbol, not just for this flight, but for every journey of those who had ever been underestimated. As an observer, I can say with certainty, Eleanor Carter's story was never just an incident on a flight. It stands as proof that true power does not live in raised voices, nor in the titles printed on a business card. True power is built through preparation, through steadfast resolve, and through the ability to turn silence into a declaration. Elena did more than keep her seat. She redrew the boundaries for an entire industry. And in that moment, she showed us all. When truth is placed squarely on the table, prejudice has nowhere left to hide. If you believe that respect should be the minimum standard owed to every person, press like and subscribe to continue with us on more stories that inspire. And do not forget to leave a comment below with just 2 simple words. Quiet power, to show that you too believe in the silent strength capable of changing the world.